Well, good afternoon. How are you? Thanks for coming out on a chilly April day. It's good to see everybody. Thank you so much for coming out for the second in this season's 2023's little lecture series. I suspect that many of you in the room will be familiar with William Faulkner's frequently quoted observation, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." Those words appear in Faulkner's 1951 novel Requiem for a Nun, which is a book ironically not much read today, considering that line has enjoyed a rather persistent life as a standalone aphorism. Faulkner's observation means, of course, that our past is part of our present, and that it engages in dialogue with the present, among other ways, through the acts of memory and history. The history of West Virginia's statehood has been very much on our minds here at the Council lately. We're coming to the end of a year-long redesign and rewrite of our popular traveling exhibit, Born of Rebellion, which tells the story of the founding of the Mountain State. And so we've been thinking a lot about history, not only as the dialogue between past and present, but also the dialogue among historians about historiography itself. That is to say, about how stories are told. That's why we're very glad today to host author Scott MacKenzie, here to talk about his book, The Fifth Border State: Slavery, Emancipation, and the Formation of West Virginia. Mackenzie's book, now out from WVU Press and available today at this lecture afterwards, traces sometimes underrepresented elements of the founding of our state in an attempt to portray the complex origins of its birth, particularly in its legislative cradle. We anticipate a lively talk and a lively follow-up discussion, so please join us as you can for refreshments following today's little lecture entitled The Fifth Border State. Scott MacKenzie.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out today. Why did West Virginia separate from Virginia in the Civil War? Historians have provided only one answer to this question for the past 160 years. Numerous inherent differences between Eastern and West Virginia, they say, led to the latter's inevitable separation in 1861 and stated 2 years later. Being the anti-Virginia has become the cornerstone of its state identity. There was a t-shirt made at the start of the COVID pandemic which read, "West Virginia, social distancing since 1863. It's a great joke, but unfortunately it's bad history. My research refutes this thesis entirely. It has nothing to do with the Civil War and its main issue of slavery. Instead, I argue that West Virginia owes its separate existence to the common experiences of the border states, the set of slaveholding states between the North and the rest of the South. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware also rejected secession. Each believed that remaining in the Union better protected slavery than joining the Confederacy. President Lincoln's pledges to that effect successfully kept them on his side throughout the war. His raising of the emancipation issue, however, tested their allegiances. Only two reluctantly embraced the measure, while two remained firmly opposed. Northwestern Virginia adds another piece to this puzzle. The region opposed secession for the same reason. Its experience with ending slavery likewise resembled theirs. Indeed, West Virginia differed from the others only in not being a state yet. Today, I'll take you through how I reached this conclusion. First, I will show how strongly the region supported slavery as a local, state, and national institution. Second, I'll compare Northwestern Virginia's responses to secession to the other border states at the war's outbreak. Third, I'll point out the role emancipation played in the statehood process and its impact on the new state's earliest years. By the end, you'll see how my new thesis about how West Virginia formed should form big changes in the state's history and its broader historical fields. Despite sitting in the middle of this chain, historians have explained West Virginia's experience differently. They have followed what I call the Ambler-Curry thesis, named after its two leading scholars, which one can find in any book on West Virginia or Civil War history. The tenets behind it include a cultural conflict between the Scots-Irish peoples of the West and the English of the East. Eastern Virginia neglected the West's economic development, that the Northwest had closer ties to Ohio and Pennsylvania, and finally, Eastern Virginia's denial of full political equality to the western counties. My research demonstrates that three of these are wrong. First, the cultural conflict idea is complete fiction. While it is true that Scots, Irish, and Germans populated the region in the 18th century, not one scholar has ever cited a single primary source supporting how this impacted statehood a century later. It appears only due to a trend in early 20th century history writing, which later scholars uncritically repeated. I dismiss it out of hand as unprovable. Second, Northwestern Virginia possessed a similar level of internal improvements as its neighbors at the time. Turnpikes existed from the earliest days. Steamboats sailed its rivers as early as the 1820s, and so in this picture here, actually from 1845. A canal project may have failed to reach the area, but railroads more than sufficiently replaced it. Virginia promised to build railroads to the west in the 1851 Constitution, and they did. They arrived in the Northwest around the same time as in western Pennsylvania and southeastern Ohio. They planned more. Virginia thus hardly neglected its western counties here. Third, the border had both commonalities and conflicts. To be sure, whites moved to and from and traded with Ohio and Pennsylvania during the antebellum period. Yet the slaves' flights to freedom in those states created troubles with the neighbors. Any claims to closer relations neglect the pivotal role of the enslaved. This leaves the only inherent difference to have merit: suffrage. Yes, it is true that the planter aristocrats of eastern Virginia restricted the right to vote and hold office to certain men, white men, holding a certain amount of property, both in land and in slaves. The Tidewater and Piedmont regions used the famous 3/5 clause that combined their white and black populations to control the state legislature. They mistrusted the mostly white western regions of the state, which held fewer in bondage. This situation has led to inaccurate views of those areas being opposed to slavery or that it was unimportant to them. On the contrary, they fully supported slavery. The northwestern population contained only between 2 and 6% of the slave populations. Those numbers are, however, deceptive. They fail to show how much the white population backed enslavement. Only one anti-slavery source, namely Henry Ruffner's 1847 pamphlet urging the removal of blacks from the area, ever came out of the region. Having a massive white majority also provided greater, not less, security for slavery by offering more people to guard them. Numerous examples exist of whites retrieving slaves from along those borders, most famous of which was Lucy Bagby's flight from Wheeling and return from Cleveland in 1861. Slavery played critical roles in the region's political history. Northwestern Virginia whites routinely voted for slaveholders. Despite making up only 1% of the population, the region's master class was widely overrepresented in its political offices. They dominated those in Kanawha and Harrison. The same occurred even in Ohio County, which had only 50 slaveholders, and several of those were women ineligible for office. Indeed, many West Virginia statemakers partook of the practice before the war. William T. Willey of Monongalia, John Carlisle of Harrison, George W. Summers of Kanawha, Short Clemens of Ohio, and others owned slaves. Francis H. Pierpont of Marion, however, did not and never held elected office prior to the war. Arthur I. Borman, on the other hand, bucked the trend and, as he owned no slaves, yet held numerous positions. These electoral patterns provide solid proof that white Northwestern Virginians opposed any change to the racial hierarchy. And in fact, they used their pro-slavery attitudes to repair relations with the state, not separate from it, at least not yet. This was no easy task. The divide between East and West was wide. This intractability showed itself strongly in 1830, when Virginia's leaders revised its Revolutionary-era Constitution. Western delegates, many of whom owned slaves, appealed to the region's reliability on the issue to extend the suffrage. The planter class obstructed them. Abel Upshur of Northampton County on the eastern shore typified Eastern attitudes when he said, quote, "The slaveholder of the East cannot calculate on the cooperation of the slaveholder of the West, in any measure calculated to protect that species of property against demands made upon it by other interests, to which the Western slaveholder are of more importance and immediate concern." Against this, Philip Doddridge of Brooke County mocked Upshur for implying the Westerners were untrue to their Virginia heritage and to slavery. Quote, "It is feared," he said, "that Westerners would forsake the example of their fathers. They'll become freebooters. Not that they'll plunder their immediate neighbors, nor will they have courage enough to attack the minority with open force." Despite this appeal, the new Constitution retained property restrictions over strong Western opposition. Aside from some angry editorials in the newspapers, the situation did not divide Virginia. Instead, 2 decades later, East and West healed the state's problems at a second convention. A new generation of slaveholding leaders like Carlisle, Summers, and Willey picked up where Doddridge started. Carlisle even boasted he was a slaveholder by purchase, not inheritance. Their stance succeeded in forcing compromises in the new Constitution. In exchange for a tax differential on slave property, the new law abolished property qualifications and promised internal improvements, which, as I said, they quickly delivered. Western Virginians voted overwhelmingly for the new Constitution, in a move that capped the state's reconciliation. Not one, but 2 Northwesterners stood for governor in the state's first Democratic election in 1851. Joseph Johnson bested George W. Summers, you see here, to head the state. So ended the one inherent difference between Western and Eastern Virginia a full decade before the Civil War. Indeed, in an oft-misquoted statement, the esteemed Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster cited in July 1851 Virginia's example to the country as a model of reconciliation and compromise despite regional differences. Virginia named a county for him in his honor for that speech, and it still exists today, although ironically now in West Virginia. There is another side to the issue. White Virginians achieved this unity on the backs of the enslaved. The 1850s saw the Northwest reinforce the gap with the East. When the war with Mexico reopened tensions over slavery's westward expansion, the Northwest sought to protect itself and the state from anti-slavery threats. The first came in the form of a newspaper, the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer. The survival of its entire run has led it to become the main source for West Virginia's early years. My comparisons of it to other newspapers, such as Cooper's Clarksburg Register and the Kanawha Valley Star, however, reveals that its criticism of slavery made it the most unpopular paper in the area. They and others likely shared the sentiment of the Fairmont True Virginian in 1857 that, quote, "we do not exchange with the Intelligencer." Second, election returns bear out how pro-slavery the region was. Despite the expanded electorate, whites continued to prefer conservative parties and candidates. The narrow election of Carlisle to Congress on the American or Know-Nothing Party ticket, 1855, surprised the region. Although the party backed slavery, and Carlisle himself being a slaveholder, his Democratic opponents swept him from office with a stalwart pro-slavery campaign 2 years later. Third, the region rallied again the following year to remove Cerrado, a Kansas-style free labor colony in Wayne County founded by Massachusetts abolitionist Eli Thayer. The last thing anyone wanted was to bring anti-slavery activists fresh from bleeding Kansas to their area. The Intelligencer's support for it, calling it the friendly invasion, further angered the population. It quickly folded. Fourth, John Brown's raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Jefferson County confirmed the region's worst fears about Cerrado and anyone anti-slavery. Finally, although the new Republican Party won few votes in the region in the 1856 and 1860 elections, its presence concerned the populace. The conversion of the Intelligencer to that party once more dented its reputation. Therefore, I must refute one of the most closely held ideas about West Virginia's formation. There were no long-standing tensions dividing the state before the Civil War. There was only one, suffrage, and they resolved it a full decade before the war. Indeed, its political behavior in the 1850s indicates that whites wanted to protect Virginia, not separate from it. Only the crazy would have predicted that is precisely what happened in the coming year. And yet, in 1861, everything changed. The election of Abraham Lincoln as the first Republican president convinced the slaveholding states about a potential threat to slavery. While his party's platform pledged only to restrict the westward progression to slavery and protect it where it existed, the lower South states declared their independence from the Union and combination into the Confederate States of America. The remaining 8 slaveholding states preferred to wait developments. Virginia gathered another convention to discuss its course of action. Most delegates from across the state, not just those from the Northwest, opposed immediate action. A shared support for slavery held this coalition together. Willie stated on March 4th that the dissolution of the Union will be the commencement of the abolition of slavery, first in Virginia, then in the border states, and then throughout the Union. Carlisle went even further when he said on March 7th that Northwesterners constituted a more loyal people to the soil their birth is nowhere to be found, a people devoted to the institution of slavery, not because of their pecuniary interest in it, because of the institution of the state. There are many more examples, but the region's pro-slavery stance held the Unionists together. On April 4th, they firmly defeated a secessionist motion. Indeed, their unity proved so strong that the Northwest delegates asked the convention to resolve the slave tax issue from the 1851 Constitution. The meeting agreed to hear it, but it succumbed to horrible timing. The date was April 11th, 1861. The next morning, the war began when South Carolina bombarded Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Lincoln responded by calling upon the loyal states for troops to put down the uprising. The Virginia Unionist coalition collapsed, and most switched to support secession, subject to a referendum weeks later. Most of the Northwestern delegates opposed it, and they returned home to carry on the fight. As a side note, the convention later voted to repeal the slave tax issue to win back the Northwest, but by then, treason outweighed revenue. The secession wave engulfed the Upper South states, but foundered on the border states. Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina soon followed Virginia's lead in siding with the Confederacy. On the other hand, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware resisted the move. Both sides sought to control this pivotal region. Historian James M. McPherson detailed the stakes. The area held 45% of Southern whites, 80% of its manufacturing capacity, and 40% of its horses and mules. It also controlled river access to the upper and lower South, as well as the South's 2 largest cities. If they fell into the Confederacy's hands, the western states and Washington itself could have been placed at stake. For Lincoln, securing the border states required reassuring their populations they would not act rashly. But it was not easy. Open violence in Maryland and Missouri, such as the Pratt Street riots in Baltimore in April and the Camp Jackson affair in St. Louis in May, compelled him to directly intervene in each state. Furthermore, Kentucky declared its neutrality in the conflict in mid-May and pledged to side against whomever violated its wishes. The Confederacy's invasion in September turned that important state against it. Such was the turmoil in the border states that 3 of the above had troubles with competing governments. Maryland's governor wavered for a time until the state assembly pressured him to declare for the Union. Kentucky and Missouri, on the other hand, each had a pro-Confederate and a pro-Union government. Only Delaware escaped this chaos when its assembly voted to reject secession in January. Lincoln's pledges to protect slavery and the right to determine their own fates, albeit necessarily aided by federal arms, kept the border states and their human, economic, and geographic resources under his control. His posture proved to be a war-winning move. Northwestern Virginia fits neatly into this pattern. After their delegates left Richmond, they returned home to a tense region. Secessionists and Unionists abounded. Militia companies like the Canal Riflemen of Charleston and the Shriver Greys of Wheeling formed. Some, like George W. Summers and Sherrod Clemens, preferred non-involvement. Wheeling's mayor appeared for calm on April 19th, as you can see in this picture right here. Still more rallied to defeat the secession referendum set for May 23rd. A rally in Clarksburg on April 22nd, and another in Fairmont on May 6th, also seen here, saw Carlisle draw hundreds, while scarcely dozens turned out for the now secessionist former Governor Johnson. Despite the tension, Unionists held their own convention in Wheeling between May 13 and 15th. At this meeting, Carlisle raised a hitherto little discussed idea: form a new state from the region. Since the delegates sought a calm and measured response to secession, they initially recoiled at this radical idea. Wayman T. Willie went so far as to call it triple treason against Virginia, the Confederacy, and the United States. The convention compromised and offered a watered-down clause as part of its official message. Notwithstanding their appeals, the referendum passed over the Northwest extensive opposition. Yet the region's fate changed quickly. Federal intervention arrived 3 days after the election. Soldiers led by a young general named George B. McClellan waited in Ohio, pending its outcome. Perhaps learning from the experiences in Maryland and Missouri, he came with a proclamation pledging to drive out the traitors and promising to protect slavery. He even negotiated with the leaders in the Kanawha Valley of the timing of his entry into that area, occupying Charleston in late June. These measures reassured many white Unionists that the Republican-headed federal government would obey its promises and respect their rights. The enslaved, however, used the chaos to begin leaving the area. The Confederacy, to which Virginia aligned itself even before the referendum, tried numerous times during that autumn to reclaim the area. Command issues, terrain, and effective Union resistance stymied their efforts at Rich Mountain, Carnifex Ferry, and Cheat Mountain. Although harassed by guerrillas, the United States Army held a strong position in northwestern Virginia by year's end. Contrast, if you will, this stability with the actions of General Benjamin Butler in eastern Virginia around this time. His decision to take escaping slaves from disloyal masters on the grounds that they were contraband of war sparked drives for emancipation across the country. If Butler had been in command of the Northwest instead of McClellan, he could have turned the area against the federal government. Thus protected, the region's Unionists gathered again in Wheeling for a second convention in mid-June. At this one, they again rejected Carlisle's statehood plan in favor of a middle option. They instead formed the reorganized government of Virginia. Headed by Francis H. Pierpont, the new administration took Virginia's place in Congress. The federal court system also resumed its operations in Wheeling, Charleston, and Clarksburg, and handed out hundreds of treason indictments. Soldiers began enlisting as early as April. Here, I reject the idea that Pierpont's government lacked authority. Lincoln employed here the same method he applied in Missouri. There, he recognized the state's constitutional convention, then sitting in St. Louis, as its government, while the state legislature and governor abandoned the state. The Confederacy may have had different ideas, but as far as the Union was concerned, Virginia had a functioning, loyal government. As Lincoln himself said in his July special address to Congress, those loyal citizens this government is bound to recognize and protect as being Virginia. The turning point towards statehood came in August. When the Wheeling Convention resumed, the idea reemerged. Many delegates feared that siding with Lincoln and the Republicans would open the dreaded emancipation issue. Carlisle acted quickly to dispel the idea. He reassured the meeting that his idea would create a loyal slave state. The delegates responded by chanting, "Cut the knot now, cut it now, apply the knife." They put the measure to a vote and won a commanding 50-28 decision. Union soldiers near Wheeling named their base in Carlisle's honor. From there, the convention submitted the decision on separation to the voters. Despite attacks on polling stations, Union voters overwhelmingly selected statehood in October. Thus began what I call the conservative phase of the statehood movement. Between November 1861 and February 1862, Wheeling hosted yet another convention to draft the Constitution for the new state. The minutes from this meeting have survived, but previous histories tend to read them thematically to analyze proceedings issue by issue. I instead read them chronologically to identify where the slavery issue appeared in their debates. The results surprised me. Delegates diligently prevented anyone from even mentioning the word. They knew too well how disruptive it could be. 3 days in the convention, Robert Hagar first did so. He cited his experience with secessionists in Boone County and proposed that gradually ending slavery would save the country. James H. Brown of Kanawha, on the left here, called his action impolitic and unwise and led the meeting to shut him up. Hagar never raised the issue again. The convention then considered the standard features of a constitution, such as the formats of the state legislature, the governorship, the court system, finances, and even the name of the state. Events moved smoothly until Ohio delegate Gordon Battelle raised the slavery issue in mid-December. Like Hagar, he introduced a gradual emancipation plan. Just as swiftly, the convention closed debate and tried to move on. He raised the issue again in mid-February. This time, held a vote hoping to end discussion once and for all. The result shocked everyone. 24 to 23 to reject it. The source of support is unclear. Delegates from the same county split their votes. As many slaveholders voted against it as for it. We may never know with certainty. The convention agreed upon a compromise clause excluding blacks, free or enslaved, from entering the new state. It passed 48 to 1. The lone holdout was not Hagar or Battelle, but William Brumfield of Wayne County, likely the most conservative delegate. Perhaps even this measure was too much for him. The convention then sent the new constitution to the voters set for April 3rd. Bumps aside, the convention achieved Carlisle's goal of forming a new slave state untainted by treason. We today would be calling him the father of West Virginia if events had not changed weeks later. The radical phase of the statehood movement began weeks later. While the region awaited the referendum, President Lincoln released his plan for voluntary and compensated emancipation for the border states. Since the start of the war, Republicans and Northern pressure compelled Lincoln to find a way to bypass his pledge to protect slavery where it existed. In December of 1861, he met secretly with George Fisher, Delaware's sole congressman, about his state, which had the smallest enslaved population, would respond to the idea. Its state senate voted 5-4 in support, but the governor and assembly rejected it. In March, Lincoln went public with the program to pay masters for their slaves and colonize them elsewhere. Famously, the border states rejected the idea. Less well known, however, are the dissenters. Of the 40 congressmen from that group, a few backed Lincoln's plans. Their identities are telling. One each came from Kentucky, Delaware, Missouri, Tennessee, and 3 of the 4 from Virginia, including a senator, Wakeman T. Willie. Given the Northwest's previous pro-slavery attitudes, something had changed. I argue that its unionists had split into 2 competing factions. Radicals supported Lincoln's war policies in response to seeing conservatives fail to take adequate measures to fight the rebels. Although hardly abolitionists, the region's delegates to Congress reflected this trend within its boundaries and not from pre-existing antipathy to slavery or partisan allegiances. The results profoundly affected the course of West Virginia statehood. The region immediately experienced the effects of the new policy. As I said, it arrived in the middle of the referendum on the new state constitution. Some radical unionists decided to hold a separate, concurrent ballot on gradual emancipation. Although unofficial, the measure drew support from across the region. Horrified conservatives tried to stop it. In one example, Andrew Parks from Kanawha, the area's Commonwealth attorney, James H. Brown, and John Hall, the president of the Constitutional Convention, went to Wayne County to encourage opposition. They failed. Both measures passed widely, even though the emancipation measure occurred in fewer counties. The mere fact that the official ballot occurred is surprising enough, given wartime conditions. Yet the happenstance of the second on a vastly more controversial issue is more remarkable since it showed how wide the divide between radical and conservative unionists had become. The best evidence for this comes from right here in Kanawha County. I found these lovely letters in Pierpont's papers in the Library of Virginia while researching my master's thesis. Upon taking office in June 1861, he purged disloyal officeholders from positions like sheriff and county court clerk. In Kanawha, the members of the Slack family took over those places. Meanwhile, the federal government appointed Benjamin H. Smith to be the United States Attorney for the District Court. The 2 groups cooperated uneasily. The court charged many secessionists with treason, yet allowed them to go free on bail where they could, if undetected, influence their Unionist family and friends. In late 1861, things changed when the Kanawha River flooded. Smith asked William J. Rand, his brother-in-law, to hire someone to repair the damage to the county's vital salt business. Rand gave the job to Elisha Williams, a known secessionist. The Slacks complained to Pierpont about the situation. While open to the charge of nepotism, Smith defended his actions on the absence of alternatives. The Slacks retaliated by organizing the Union Club of Charleston and a petition drive to further agitate against disloyal people participating in the loyal government. The Confederate occupation of the Kanawha Valley, September and October 1862, worsened the situation. The Slacks reported to Pierpont that conservatives openly welcomed the rebel soldiers, many of whom were family and friends. In one case, Smith supported the return of his son, Isaac Noy Smith, and friend John P. Hale to the county without taking the oath of allegiance once the Confederates had left. Smith and Hale resumed their business activities against the Slacks' wishes. Events like this likely occurred in other counties. The friction caused by conservatives placing ties to secessionist kin resulted in a split among Unionists. Radicals turned to emancipation as the best way to fight the rebellion. This, of course, meant little to the enslaved. This conversion spilled over into Congress. The conventional view of its debates on West Virginia statehood maintains that Republicans compelled the new state to accept emancipation, that John Carlisle switched to oppose the movement, and Wait-Till Willie saved the day with his famous compromise amendment. The first two are wrong, while the third needs elaboration. This view ignores events within the state, and particularly the changes among Unionists and the actions of the enslaved. The truth is this. After receiving the reorganized government's constitutional authorization for the formation of the new state, Willie introduced the bill to the Senate on May 29th. In it, he claimed that West Virginia never supported slavery, despite his personal ownership and previous statements to the contrary. It had, quote, never flourished there, it never can. The inexorable laws of climate forbid it, he said. He then stated that self-emancipation had reduced the enslaved population by a quarter since the start of the war. Thus, there was no need for a gradual emancipation clause, since the federal government and the enslaved were already moving in that direction. Radicals reinforced Willie's words with a special appeal. Granville Parker, seen on the left here, published and distributed a 10-page pamphlet entitled An Appeal of the People of West Virginia to Congress, arguing for that body and the president to make the new state a free one. Republicans responded positively to this seed. I reprinted this long-ignored yet vitally important text in an appendix to my book. Conservatives fought back immediately against this betrayal. A month later, on June 29th, Carlisle tried to stop the radicals from destroying his baby. He proposed an amendment to the statehood bill which added 15 counties and a gradual emancipation clause, knowing that no one would ever support such a law. Even the influential anti-slavery Senator Charles Sumner turned against the measure. Willie responded with his own amendment in early July. The first clause, which called for freeing slaves born in West Virginia after July 4th, 1863, repeated Carlisle's own bill. The next two clauses pledged to free slaves under the age of 10 when they turned 21, and those over 10 years old under 21 when they hit 25. These are essentially empty and meaningless. Those age groups included those enslaved most likely to have already fled or who soon would. The fourth clause, forbidding slaves from returning, was likewise moved. The Willie Amendment therefore satisfied white needs by exploiting black actions. Now, on the next day, July 15th, the Senate voted 23 to 17 to pass the bill. Most Republicans supported it, but not Sumner. Opponents included almost all Democrats and all but one border state senator, Willie. His amendment had indeed saved the day. It was Carlisle who bore the brunt of local criticism. Many newspapers, including conservative ones, assailed him for failing to support statehood. He defended himself in late July in Indianapolis, condemning Congress for allowing, quote, the controlling working majority, carrying out the policy of such men as abolitionist Wendell Phillips. Union soldiers responded by renaming their Wheeling base to their new hero, Willie. So therefore, I counter every previous history on the subject when I conclude that Carlisle did not abandon the statehood movement. It abandoned him. West Virginia worked its way into Lincoln's heart. He reciprocated his support for its policies. He exempted the region from the Emancipation Proclamation. In it, he excluded, quote, the 48 counties designated West Virginia, and technically a 49th in Berkeley County. Jefferson County was included, along with most of the rest of Virginia. Even better news came from the Union War Governors Conference in Altoona, Pennsylvania in late September. The gathering gave his move a mixed reception, with even non-slaveholding states opposing it. Yet Governor Pierpont, alone among the border slaveholding states, supported it. These acts solidified in Lincoln's mind that he had an ally whom he must support. He leaned on his Republicans to back the statehood bill when it came before the House of Representatives in December. They spent a mere day and a half debating the bill and passing it 95-56. The measure then went to the White House for his signature. In an unusual move, he asked the cabinet two legal questions: whether the question was constitutional and whether it was expedient. Each of his 6 ministers was an experienced lawyer, so the briefs make for interesting reading. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton's was a mere page and a half, while Attorney General Edward Bates produced an impenetrable, thickly argued 13 handwritten page essay. 3 voted yes to both questions, while 3 said no. Previous accounts have argued that Lincoln felt deep ambivalence over this deadlock. Surely Pierpont thought so when he telegrammed Lincoln as he waited for word. I don't agree. His own brief indicates he felt completely confident in his decision. On the first question, is it constitutional? Lincoln answered that the reorganized government most certainly possessed the authority to grant permission to transform part of its territory into the new state. Border state conservatives such as Bates assumed that the federal government considered secessionists to be errant citizens whose rights it must protect. Lincoln's response, however, shows that he now differentiated between the loyal and the disloyal. Counting the constitutional rights of rebellious citizens made no sense to him. He wrote, "Can this government stand if it indulges constitutional constructions by which men in open rebellion against it are to be counted, man for man, the equals of those who maintain their loyalty to it? Are they to be accounted even better citizens and more worthy of consideration than those who merely neglect to vote? If so, their treason against the Constitution enhances their constitutional value. Without braving these absurd conclusions, we cannot deny that the body which consents to the admission of West Virginia is the legislature of Virginia." Braving these absurd conclusions is my new favorite Lincoln quote. On the second question, is it expedient? Lincoln came right to the point. While he admitted that the question, quote, is more a question for Congress than for the executive, he asserted his responsibility to answer, writing, "Still, I do not evade it." No one has asked what he meant by expedient. One could easily infer his war policies, but I think he meant something specific: his border state emancipation plan, of which West Virginia was his only supporter. He wrote, and you can read for yourself here, "We can scarcely dispense with the aid of West Virginia in this struggle. Much less can we afford to have her against us, in Congress and in the field. Her brave and good men regard her admission into the Union as a matter of life and death. They have been true to the Union under very severe trials. We have so acted as to justify their hopes, and we cannot fully retain their confidence or cooperation if we seem to break faith with them. In fact, they could do not so much for us if they would. Again, the admission of a new state turns that much slave soul to free, and thus is a certain and irrevocable encroachment upon the cause of the rebellion." Lincoln may have dreaded the precedent set by this act, but he still pursued it. He concluded that the measure was expedient because, quote, "there is still difference enough between secession against the Constitution and secession in favor of the Constitution." There are 2 key phrases here. First, he wrote, "in Congress and in the field," meaning he knew of Virginia's voting record favoring his emancipation plan during the previous year. Second, is turns that much slave soul to free, which provides perfect proof that he linked statehood with his support for his emancipation policy. When he signed his name to the bill on December 31st in front of Pierpont, Willey, and other delegates, it was his reward for their support for his policies. I reject the notion that he felt any concern over the measure, nor did his political instincts unduly influence his constitutional or legal arguments. These are not the words of an anxious man, and the recent defeat at Fredericksburg and looming enactment of the Emancipation Proclamation would haunt anyone. If anything, granting West Virginia's request for statehood was one of the few rays of hope for the otherwise horrible year. The radicals used their strong position to overcome conservative opposition to enact the Willey Amendment. Despite the Jones impotent raid's interference, Union voters approved it in late March. Here I refute another long-held belief about the subject. Congress did not force emancipation on West Virginia. The radicals then in charge of the statehood movement requested it. They pay a heavy price for doing so when, on June 20th, 1863, West Virginia joined the Union as the 35th state. Statehood brought no peace. The radical administration of Governor Arthur I. Borman faced numerous threats from the outset. In his inaugural address, he rallied the loyal Unionists by blaming Eastern Virginia's, quote, "unfairness and inequality of legislation and taxation for the construction of railroads and canals in the East for causing the West to separate." He then asked them to support his and the federal government's measures needed to fight the rebels, including Emancipation, of which West Virginia was a strong supporter. In April 1864, both of its senators, Willie and Peter G. Van Winkle, supported the 13th Amendment. The state voted for Lincoln in that year's election, although strong conservative opposition appeared in places like Wheeling. In January 1865, the state's congressional representatives backed the amendment in the House. At the same time, the state assembly ratified the measure and abolished slavery within its borders. John H. Atkinson of Hancock County said, "Slavery is dead at last." Daniel Peck of Ohio County responded with a quote from the book of Revelations, "Yes, and the smoke of his torment ascendeth up and forever and ever." These responses place West Virginia well among the other border states. Maryland and Missouri also turned radical, abolishing slavery within their borders and supporting the 13th Amendment. Kentucky and Delaware, on the other hand, remained under conservative rule and refused ratification until the next century. In 1861, Northwestern Virginia resisted secession as a threat to slavery. 4 awful, tortured years later, West Virginia happily signed it away. The end of the war made a bad situation worse. Returning rebels, many of whom received federal pardons, expected to resume their political rights. One, Jonathan Rundle, the former editor of the Kanawha Valley Star, threatened violence to get them. Quote, "If you treat us right and not insult us, we will keep quiet. But if you don't, then these hills will be filled with sharpshooters," he wrote upon returning to Confederate service. Borman there rightfully feared that they, when combined with conservative Unionists, would defeat his administration and possibly overturn the existence of the state itself. Rumblings in Virginia, now run by Francis Pierpont, confirmed that view. The Radicals newspaper, The Intelligencer, soon had a powerful rival in the Wheeling Daily Register. Its editor, Lewis Baker, turned his time in Union prison into fiery invective against King Arthur and the Radicals. So, as in Maryland and Missouri, Virginia imposed strict prescriptions to forbid rebels from voting, holding office, suing state courts, teaching, or preaching. Conservatives fought back at the polls. In 1866, they ran as the, quote, "white man's party," with Benjamin H. Smith as its candidate for governor, leaving no doubt as to whose votes they wanted. Borman, however, won re-election through the prescriptions, but also by avoiding the race issue. The latter method consisted of offloading responsibility for blacks on the Federal Freedmen's Bureau. This led to one of the Radicals' lasting legacies, the formation of the then whites-only West Virginia University in Morgantown. Black students instead went to the now defunct Storer College in Harper's Ferry. After the Bureau folded, the state provided little for black pupils in their much-promoted public school system, or in general. The Radicals' grip on power proved to be so strong it survived ratifying the 14th Amendment in 1866. The mere hint of granting black citizenship and equal protection under the law buckled Maryland's Radicals, leading to its new conservative constitution in that year. Missouri held firm for now. When former Confederate Charles J. Faulkner from Berkeley County used a technicality to resume his legal career, the state legislature passed a constitutional amendment to protect the prescriptions. Afterwards, the township system became the main instrument for keeping former rebels from voting. Any loyal citizen could accuse another, without corroboration, of supporting the Confederacy to deny them suffrage. The most famous case of this came from Greenbrier County, where Joseph L. Caldwell earned the nickname Old Scratch for his counsel removing virtually everyone from the voting rolls. Some accused him of allowing only himself, his son, 2 Irishmen, and a black to vote. This is likely false, but the charge stuck. Tensions escalated in 1868 and 1869 as the Radicals continued to stay in power. Collapse came suddenly when the Radicals backed the 15th Amendment in 1869. Conservatives understandably rallied against the granting of voting rights to blacks. The Greenbrier Independent called this move the act of a, quote, "West Virginia hog and horse-thieving legislature." As in Missouri, which later ratified it, the Radical Party split into mainstream and led-up factions. The latter sought to reconcile with former rebels by ending the prescriptions and restoring their citizenship. Thus divided, the Radical Party lost its majority. In 1871, the state legislature and voters approved the Flick Amendment enacting these measures. Merely rescinding the prescriptions, however, was not enough. Conservatives sought to purge the state of every vestige of radical rule. In January 1872, delegates met in Charleston to draft the new state constitution. Many stayed at the Hale House Hotel, named for John P. Hale. The first target, replacing the hated township system with the previous county court system. Later that year, voters approved the new law by a narrow margin. West Virginia's historians have called this the counter-revolution, but I prefer the term used to describe the same process in the border states: redemption, or to save from sin. In this case, the sin of emancipation. As in Missouri, conservatives removed radicals for daring to question the racial hierarchy. even though they did not. This Constitution still governs the state of West Virginia today. So to return to my main question, why are we in West Virginia and not in Virginia? My answer is 3 parts. First, the Ambler-Curry thesis that West Virginia was distinct from Virginia is unworkable. Only one of its 4 tenets, suffrage, is credible. Reconciliation, not division, better describes antebellum Virginia's internal relations. Yet whites based their unity on a shared commitment to slavery. Indeed, they reinforced the seal in the succeeding decade by protecting Virginia and the other slaveholding states. Few could have predicted that the region would consider separation, but it happened. Second, statehood could only have taken place within the context of the border states. Like Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, Northwest Virginia rejected secession from their common belief that the Union better protected slavery. Although their fickle nature tested him, President Lincoln's promises to keep the resources under his control worked. Statehood movement began from Charles Carlyle's idea, but it took 2 abortive starts and much persuasion for it to become a reality. Its success depended on keeping the slavery issue off the table. Despite the near miss in the convention, the region seemed poised to form a new slave state in accordance with Carlyle's wishes. Had events not changed mere days later, he would be known today as the father of West Virginia, but they changed. Third, emancipation exerted a powerful influence on the statehood movement. Contrary to the region's long-held pro-slavery views, its leaders supported Lincoln's Border State Emancipation Plan. The impetus came from within the region, not from above, as previously believed. Kanawha County showed how seeing conservative unionists associate with secessionist kin spurred the radicals to embrace emancipation. Their stance took the movement out of Carlyle's hands into Lincoln's, who rewarded them with free statehood. Conservatives spent the next 9 years retaliating against the radicals for betraying the racial order. They succeeded only because the radicals divided over passing the 15th Amendment, just as in Missouri. Their legacy still governs the state. My research should prompt some serious rethinking of West Virginia's origins and its place in history. Instead of being the product of long-standing tensions among whites, the state formed because of the Great Civil War with slavery and the specific context of the border states. The only difference between it and the others, it was not a state yet. For these reasons, we should henceforth see West Virginia as the 5th border state.